So a few months ago, I made a video about tolerance, right? How tolerance kills societies. And I had a lot of things wrong there, including my failure of understanding nuance and a lack of examples in a contemporary context. In this video, we'll be exploring why I was wrong the last time, and exploring in contemporary context why the gender and gay marriage movements in the last 20 years have made sense in the context of history of the last few decades. So strap in, and we'll get right started. So before we get into the real meat of things, we'll do a little quick introduction of what I think tolerance means in this case, past the dictionary definition, what I got last time, and then we'll finally dive into these, really controversial, meaty issues. So to introduce, I'm going to just simply define tolerance, right? Tolerance is the reception to outside or external ideas that might disagree with your actual feelings, and usually has a tone of more benevolence or morality that goes beyond your own individual feelings, usually for the greater good. So tolerance, I believe, which is one of the thing I didn't get right last time, is that it has two sides of tolerance. Nuance, right? You have institutional tolerance and external tolerance. Internal or institutional tolerance will be kind of things like you work within the system, but you bring in new ideas that supplement the system because you're still working within the system to improve the system. So a great example of this would be voter rights in America, right? So if we're all familiar with the voter and suffrage movements of different racial, sexual minority groups, over the last century, 2 centuries, right, you're going to notice that there's a lot of things being done. However, there's always a thing to be changed that still keeps society intact. However, you still see the change happening nonetheless. That is because despite, even like going back to the Jacksonian Democratic Revolution of the 1820s, right, you're going to see that you have a lot of people who aren't white landowners, who are still white, obviously, right? White landowners still getting the ability to vote. So we're still working in that whole space of, okay, you're a landowner, but now you don't need to be. However, you're still a white male and you're still within the same voting system. Same thing applies, right? You're a male, but you're black. You're a human, but you're a woman, right? This keeps going on, and that is what social progression is and has been characterized by. An example of external or, non-institutional tolerance that tries to break the system would be any sort of sympathy, I guess, towards communism or fascism in America, which was very, very unpopular. But communism before the Cold War was actually very popular, right? This would be trying to bring in foreign ideas like the Communist Revolution and the workers of the world unite into a heavily capitalistic, industrialized country like the United States, who was a very, very powerful country back in a time when, like, the Communist Party USA was thriving. And that is an example of bringing in an idea which isn't going to actually build onto the existing institutions, and instead it tries to tear it down. Whether or not, obviously I think they were mostly good-willed, but that doesn't matter, right? So tolerance of those kind of ideas, right, these Communist Party USA, isn't good tolerance. We shouldn't tolerate that kind of idea, and especially not for the sake of being tolerant. And for that reason, we still have laws in place that allow us to, kick out communists or people like actively actively working towards the destruction of American democracy or capitalism, what the hell am I saying, in the pursuit of a communist revolution, right? You can think still, but we still have laws in place that we can deport you and stuff. Anyways, those are the two examples and a nuance that is added to the definition of tolerance. And we're going to quickly go over what I presented as my argument last time, which is the thesis fundamentorum. Basically, last time I thought that societal evolution or societal change is a cyclical pattern. While that is true to a case, that's only when you work within institutions, where institutions get an antithesis to its thesis, and they make a synthesis, making a better institution, right? So there is no exodus fundamentorum, which means you're exiting the current fundamentals, right? It's actually a cyclical form between thesis, antithesis, and nova, which is new, right? So, in fact, there is a very big difference between institutional and external tolerance. Whereas institutional tolerance works within the system, introducing the antithesis, and then, therefore, creating a new fundamentorum, right? Where you're able to make a new society with social change, and therefore, that society can be changed as well, right? Just like how we kept building and building on voter rights in America. Whereas, on the outside, we have external tolerance. In external tolerance, it goes from thesis to antithesis to Exodus, but there is no Nova. It just ends there and it becomes a new civilization, a new society altogether, or a new institution altogether, because a true antithesis to an existing institution does not build to the institution. Instead, it by nature breaks it down and therefore devolves it of its purpose, and therefore you do not have that initial institution. And this is going to be very, very relevant when we talk about the gender and marriage issues in the current world and how this might have happened. So before I bore you, let's first discuss why, what are these two issues, how have they gotten here, and why this matters. So the first thing we'll be talking about is a gender issue. So obviously, traditionally understood, there are two genders, male and female, and if you want to talk about sex, there's male and female, and intersex, which is a genetic condition, which is a, very unfortunate for many people because it often prevents you from giving birth or having fertile sperm, right? So those are the three classifications of sex and the two of gender. However, in recent times, as a extension of postmodern theory, I guess, where you can't really prove anything, there are numerous genders, and it is your own reality to choose which. I do not have a strong opinion on this either way. I believe that it is within individual choice. However, it is in society's interest to prioritize this or not prioritize this. Right? That is what we are out to do. And so you see a lot of different arguments which support this, right? Especially in the case of transgenderism, right? The primary thing that you want to be talking about is that people are, the sociological argument, which is that people are able to choose what they are because gender is simply a social construct. We hear this a lot, and this is probably the most mainstream argument. And it's very hard to refute because, it is a social construct. At least gender roles are. But the question is, does that mean that just because they're social constructs, are they bad? Just like how we think the law is probably good, right? And then you have the alternate argument for at least within transgender binaries, right? People, male to female, female to male, which is that, in fact, you have a physical change in your brain where you have a physical difference between transgender females and transgender males, which align more with their preferred sex. Now, I find both of these interesting because they are inherently self-contradictory, right? Is it a physical change or is it a social thing? The truth is it's mostly social, right? The physical things, if anything, don't actually support a sociological change. In fact, it just indicates to a mental condition or a genetic condition, right, as it has been. And the important part of this is a lot of the arguments around the gender binary and the sort of leftist push to get rid of it. And this is because gender binaries and gender expectations and the norms are, in fact, to a certain degree, extremely repressive and have been in the past for either sex, especially for women. Now, this is an extension, a lot of people call transgender an extension of fourth wave feminism. I don't even believe that. But this makes no sense, right? Because here's the thing. There are ways to be tolerant to people acting outside of the gender norm without devolving to external tolerance, which is tolerating the idea of removing the gender norm. So let me explain. So traditionally, right, women are the homemakers while men are the breadwinners, right? That is the traditional terminology and the idea that is being used. However, as we explained in the last video about patriarchy, that has since evolved, and therefore that doesn't need to be strictly enforced. Therefore, it is, it's reasonable to try to break down this norm. However, this has existed for thousands of years, and this is what our current civilization, and probably every civilization, is based on fundamentally. Therefore, removing it seems not, the right course of action. But there's a deeper reason for that. If you want to be tolerant of people not acting within the gender norm, if you want to be tolerant of men wanting to wear dresses, and women wanting to go and work in construction, you can do that without eliminating the binary, which is the fundamental that we talked about in the last video, right? That is the fundamental institution, which is the gender binary, right? The way to be tolerant within that institution is to say, okay, we want everyone to learn these norms, to work within these values. However, if you choose to, not follow those norms or values, then that's okay as well. And the external tolerance way of approaching people like that who don't fall within is saying that the whole binary is stupid, therefore we should remove it, due to the fact that there are people who do not fit in. So that is like essentially tolerance stretched to the max. Instead of trying to work within the institution of the gender binary and to create spaces for people who do not conform, you try to flip the whole table up. You try to flip the whole script, remove the institution, thereby giving people freedom to work within it. However, because this institution of the gender binary and gender norms and roles have been around for the last couple thousand years, it simply doesn't work, and we aren't prepared for whatever consequences that might arise. We're already seeing a little bit of this. However, we are not prepared for whatever unknown, godforsaken social consequences exist from completely eliminating the gender binary. Now, most people probably don't want to do this, but this is my refutation against the left on that matter. And, okay, so that's the gender issue. Maybe we'll come back to it if something comes up. But next is marriage, specifically gay marriage. So we talked a lot about in the unedited video, which was... that was the video. About the institution of marriage, why it exists in history, and what its utility is. Actually, I believe we do talk about this in the last video about patriarchy as well. But basically, marriage is an institution in the past in which a man is bound to society and the wife, therefore encouraging him to use his aggression and testosterone to do good, whereas the woman is encouraged to have as many children as possible because of the high infant mortality rate, which means that you're not going to be able to have all of your kids survive past age 5. Right, that is the initial, and also to protect against syphilis. By not having people, be polygamous and have sex with multiple people, you're able to, at least, the very least, restrict and possibly eliminate sexually transmitted diseases such as syphilis. So basically, marriage is an institution designed to protect society from violent men, protect it from losing population because of women not having kids, and to protect it against very, very tragic diseases like syphilis, which ends your life. Basically, you're not functional anymore. And marriage has always been this institution which has built up everything around it. Marriage is one of the things that actually enforces and encourages the gender norms and gender roles that have already been assigned to each sex. And eliminating marriage altogether, or the meaning of it, of meaningful matrimony, right, that has social consequences, right, which we are already seeing now today. Making marriage this wishy-washy thing that can have lots of divorces leads to a lot of kids being, lost to the whims of their parents, where there is no actual social pressure to keep together, therefore leading to a lot of different social diasporas, where in fact kids are not able to perform as well because maybe they don't have two parents in the household. Kids need stability. This has been proven many times, right? If you want to read like Rob K. Henderson's book, Troubled, that's been made, that was a very, very poignant story, which really highlights that point. And so marriage has come to be this institution that's been very important in building things like the nuclear family, or even building up the community, right? The nuclear family isn't the end-all be-all, even though it kind of turned into it in the 1960s as religion started to fall down. But the nuclear family is the backbone of greater community. And if you lose the nuclear family, you lose community, like we're seeing today. And there's all these different intertwining points, right? Religion creates community. People aren't being religious. But however, religion also encourages childbirth, but people aren't having kids. And religion also doesn't like divorce that much. However, people are getting divorced. You have all these different intertwining factors that lead us to today, where marriage isn't as impactful. And I think one of the best examples of this is the introduction of gay marriage, right? Again, let us recall the initial purpose of marriage is to maximize the potential of both the man and woman in the relationship, therefore benefiting society, because there are roles for each of them to play. And even if that doesn't apply today, because you don't need 10 kids to have three survive, even if that doesn't survive today, so many other parts of society are built around this basic assumption, and therefore there are unintended social consequences, whether it be very subtle or very, very blunt, of eliminating the meaning of marriage. And that's an example of gay marriage being an external tolerance, where it's still marriage. However, the initial purpose of marriage, the fundamentals of it, was man and woman to maximize the potential of both to improve society. However, by trying to suggest that marriage is only about love, and therefore man and man can do marriage, you are, whether or not it's correct, whether or not it's moral, you are inadvertently subverting the initial purpose of marriage and turning it into something else. That's why we have to turn legal union now, because marriage doesn't mean it as much as it did anymore. That's not to say that everyone is, doing this. Marriage means nothing to everyone. However, as changes happen, as more external tolerant, as we try to be more externally tolerant to these new ideas like gay marriage, you're going to find that there is a certain level of exodus fundamentorum where you see the breakdown of currently existing institutions like marriage, right? Again, the number one thing is divorces, right? You might say, oh, that's because divorces are legal now, blah, 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 right? But here's the thing. Divorces happen anyways because marriage doesn't mean anything. If it was like in, I don't know, 1540, they didn't even let kings have divorces without crazy political work, right? And whether or not you liked it, whether or not it was abusive, it kept the basic structure together of families and kept society running, right? A lot of things that we have right now, we've had it because it worked. And it brought us to where we are today. And therefore, trying to be externally tolerant to ideas that are antitheses of currently existing institutions isn't necessarily a good change. And so that is ultimately what it comes down to, right? It's that tolerance has two different ways of working within it. You have tolerance of internal or institutional ideas, which actually elevate the pre-existing institutions, which we see as good, or you have external tolerance, wherein in the process of trying to tolerate external ideas which are not beneficial to the institution and rather pervert the initial ideas and values, you are bringing in possible misfortune, strife, all of these different negative things that might impact society in small ways or big ways. If anything, we aren't yet to see the final consequences of this. I think the biggest indicator is divorce. I don't think the gender issue is going to go further than this because of its natural contradictions and its lack of a coherent leader, as we've talked about in the past. However, these are examples of things that we need to be careful of, because while they seem progressive and tolerant and mindful and even moral in some ways of respecting individual thoughts, feelings, and opinions, we need to consider the possible damage it does on the greater institution of gender binary or gender roles and marriage, because that is ultimately what our society is based upon. Here's the thing. There may or may not be a way to go forward. Perhaps, like I said before, external tolerance is necessary to bring in truly radical ideas. However, for ideas that have served us for all of eternity, basically, which is, or Western civilization for all of eternity, of the Western civilization, what the hell am I saying? Such as monogamous heterosexual marriage and the gender binary, which both enforce each other, right? Then you have a risk involved when you're trying to create these changes, because you don't know what the outsized consequences are going to be, because we don't know yet, and that's in the future, obviously. All right, anyways, that was today's video, right? It was a bit shorter than most, I would say, thankfully. But I think I hit some important points about the nuance between external and internal tolerance, where new ideas aren't necessarily good. They must work within the institution or the existing system to improve upon it. However, external tolerance sometimes has its place. However, it needs to be careful when trying to touch deeply rooted issues and deeply rooted ideas that have different spillovers to different parts of society. And, as we move more into a more progressive modern world, we're going to see how this plays out. And it's going to be really interesting to see where this goes. So if you have any comments, concerns, questions, thoughts, or any discussion points, please leave them in the comment section down below. I do my best to answer all of them all the time. So yeah, it's been Rhetoric Reviewed. Out. Peace.